I stood in my grandson's nursery doorway, watching my daughter-in-law Ashley pack his belongings into cardboard boxes with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. She moved through Tommy's room like she owned it, folding his tiny clothes, and wrapping his toys in newspaper without a second glance at the woman who had bought every single item in that room. The same woman who had just co-signed a loan extension that would keep them from losing their house. The same woman she had called smelly and disgusting not 20 minutes earlier, thinking I couldn't hear her from the kitchen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My heart didn't pound with rage. It didn't shatter with grief. Those reactions belonged to a version of myself that still believed family meant something to people like Ashley. Now it just sat there, steady and certain, while I watched her pack up my world like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. What she didn't know, as she folded Tommy's favorite blanket, the one I had knitted during those sleepless nights after his birth, was that I had already made a phone call. One simple call to the bank, withdrawing my guarantee on their loan extension. A call that would change everything by morning. My name is Dorothy, though everyone has always called me Dot. At 73, I've learned that people show you who they truly are when they think you're not paying attention. I'm a grandmother, a widow, a retired school librarian who believed that family was everything. I believed it so fiercely that I spent the last 3 years of my life arranging mine around a son who forgot where he came from, and a daughter-in-law who never wanted me to be part of where they were going. But this is the story of how I reminded them both. My life before this moment had been built on small, steady acts of love. I was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who showed up to every soccer game, who kept photo albums organized by year and event. I made Christmas cookies in November so they'd be perfect by December. I sent care packages to my son Marcus during his college years, filled with homemade brownies and handwritten notes that I signed Love Mom in the same careful cursive I'd used to grade homework for 37 years. When Marcus graduated with his engineering degree, I was the loudest voice cheering from the audience. When he got his first job at a consulting firm in Denver, I helped him move across 3 states, driving a U-Haul because he couldn't afford professional movers. When he met Ashley at a company party 2 years later, I welcomed her like the daughter I'd never had. I wanted so desperately to love her, to be loved by her, to build the kind of multi-generational family that gathers for Sunday dinners and holiday traditions. Marcus had always been my pride and joy. Not because he was perfect, but because he was kind. As a child, he brought home stray cats and injured birds, convinced that love and patience could heal anything broken. He called me every Sunday through college, even when his friends teased him for being a mama's boy. He sent me flowers on Mother's Day with cards that said things like, "Thank you for teaching me that gentleness is strength." I thought I had raised a man who understood loyalty, who valued the people who had sacrificed for him. Maybe I had. Maybe the Marcus I raised was still there somewhere beneath the version Ashley preferred. Ashley was different from the girls Marcus had dated before. She was polished in a way that felt calculated, with perfect makeup and designer clothes that whispered money and status. She worked in marketing and spoke about personal branding and networking opportunities like they were sacred concepts. When Marcus first brought her home for Thanksgiving, she complimented my house in that particular tone people use when they're being generous about something they consider inferior. "This is so charming," she said, running her finger along my grandmother's china cabinet. So authentic and vintage. The way she said vintage made it sound like a museum piece, something quaint and outdated but harmless enough to admire from a distance. I told myself she was nervous. Meeting the parents is always stressful, and some people cope by creating distance. I had seen it before in my teaching days, children who acted out because they didn't know how to ask for acceptance. So I tried harder. I cooked her favorite foods, learned about her work, asked thoughtful questions about her life. I genuinely wanted to understand the woman who had captured my son's heart. But Ashley wasn't nervous. She was evaluating. Every conversation felt like an interview where I was being measured against some invisible standard I couldn't identify. She smiled at my stories but never asked follow-up questions. She accepted my gifts but never seemed particularly grateful. She laughed at my jokes, but in a way that suggested she was being polite rather than genuinely amused. I kept thinking that time would soften her edges, that once she felt secure in our family, she would relax into the warmth I was offering. When they got engaged after 18 months of dating, I cried tears of joy. Not because I loved Ashley, I was still trying to figure out how to love her, but because Marcus was happy. The wedding planning became my first real insight into who Ashley truly was beneath the polished surface. She had opinions about everything and the budget to enforce. Most of them. The venue had to be elegant. The flowers had to be imported. The dress had to be custom designed. Every detail was curated to project an image of success and sophistication. I offered to help with costs, thinking it would be a bonding experience for us. Ashley accepted my contribution, but made it clear that my financial help didn't earn me input into decisions. When I suggested including my late husband's favorite hymn in the ceremony, she dismissed it as too traditional. When I offered to make the wedding favors, something I had done for dozens of friends over the years, she explained that they had already hired a professional because consistency of presentation was important. I smiled and stepped back, telling myself that every bride deserves her dream wedding. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that Ashley wasn't just particular about her wedding. She was particular about erasing any trace of Marcus's history that didn't align with the future she was designing. The wedding itself was beautiful in the way magazine spreads are beautiful. Flawless, expensive, and somehow cold. I wore the dress Ashley had approved, smiled for the photographers she had hired, and gave the toast she had edited. Marcus looked handsome and happy, and that was enough for me. Or so I convinced myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After they returned from their honeymoon in Italy, they moved into a new house in an upscale neighborhood 40 minutes from where I lived. It was a beautiful home with clean lines and neutral colors, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a design catalog. When they invited me for dinner to see their new space, I brought a casserole dish filled with Marcus's favorite lasagna and a small housewarming gift. A framed photo of Marcus as a child, laughing on the swing set his father had built in our backyard. Ashley accepted both graciously, but I noticed that the lasagna went into the refrigerator without being served, and the photo never made it out of the gift bag. When I asked about it a few weeks later, she explained that they were still deciding on their aesthetic and would find the perfect spot for it soon. The perfect spot, as far as I could tell, was somewhere I would never see it again. Their first year of marriage established patterns that I told myself were temporary adjustments. Sunday dinners, which had been a tradition in our family for as long as Marcus could remember, became monthly dinners, then occasional dinners, then dinners that happened when Ashley felt like cooking for guests. My phone calls to Marcus started being filtered through Ashley, who would answer with updates about their busy schedules and promises that Marcus would call me back when things slowed down. I tried to adapt. I started calling less frequently. I stopped dropping by unannounced. I waited for invitations instead of extending them. I told myself that newlyweds needed space to build their own traditions, that Ashley was probably just protective of their time together. I had been young once. I remembered how overwhelming it could feel when in-laws wanted too much too soon. But the distance wasn't temporary, and it wasn't about space. It was about replacement. Ashley wasn't just building a new life with Marcus. She was systematically editing out the old one, and I was the largest reminder of everything she wanted him to forget. The shift became undeniable when Tommy was born. My first grandchild, the baby I had been dreaming about since Marcus was old, enough to play with toy cars and talk about having kids someday. When Ashley went into labor, Marcus called me from the hospital, breathless with excitement and terror. "Mom, it's happening," he said, and I could hear the boy I had raised underneath, the man he had become. "We're going to have a baby." I drove to the hospital immediately, my hands shaking with anticipation as I parked in the visitor's lot. I had imagined this moment for months, holding my grandson for the first time, seeing Marcus become a father, being part of the circle of love that welcomes a new life into the world. I brought a gift bag filled with tiny clothes I had sewn during the long months of Ashley's pregnancy, each piece made with the kind of attention to detail that comes from having nothing but time and love to pour into every stitch. But when I arrived at the maternity ward, I learned that Ashley had created a list of approved visitors, and I wasn't on it for the first 24 hours. The nurses were apologetic, but firm. New mothers needed time to recover, they explained. Family visits would be scheduled according to the mother's preferences. I could see Marcus through the window of Ashley's room, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in hospital blankets. His face transformed by a joy so pure it made my chest ache with pride and longing. I waited in the hospital cafeteria for 6 hours, drinking bad coffee and watching other families celebrate their new arrivals. I told myself that Ashley was tired, that labor had been difficult, that she deserved to rest before dealing with visitors. I told myself that 24 hours was nothing in the span of a lifetime, that I would have decades to love this baby, that patience was a virtue I had learned from years of working with children. When I was finally allowed to meet Tommy, he was perfect in the way that only babies can be perfect, small and soft and completely trusting. Ashley let me hold him for exactly 15 minutes before explaining that he needed to eat and that too much stimulation wasn't good for newborns. I memorized everything about those 15 minutes. The weight of him in my arms, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, the soft sounds he made as he slept. I wanted to sing to him the lullabies I had sung to Marcus, but the room felt too formal, too supervised for such intimacy. Over the following months, my access to Tommy was carefully managed through Ashley's schedule and preferences. I could visit on Tuesday afternoons for 2 hours, but only if I called ahead to confirm that it was still convenient. I could babysit occasionally, but only at their house, and only when Ashley provided detailed instructions about feeding times, nap schedules, and approved activities. I offered to keep Tommy overnight so they could have date nights, but Ashley explained that he wasn't ready to be away from her for that long. I understood some of her caution. First-time mothers are naturally protective, and I respected her instincts about what was best for her child. But it wasn't just caution. It was control. Ashley managed my relationship with Tommy the same way she managed everything else in their lives, with careful boundaries that kept me close enough to be useful, but far enough away to remain insignificant. The breaking point began to build when Marcus lost his job. The consulting firm where he had worked for 5 years was downsizing, and his position was eliminated along with dozens of others. It wasn't his fault, wasn't about his performance, just the kind of corporate restructuring that happens when companies prioritize profits over people. Marcus was devastated, not just about the lost income, but about the threat to the lifestyle he and Ashley had built together. Their house payments were significant. Ashley's car payment was significant. The private daycare where Tommy spent his days was significant. Everything about their life required 2 professional incomes, and suddenly, they were down to 1. Marcus threw himself into job hunting with the desperation of a man who had too much to lose, but the market was competitive, and good positions were scarce. That's when Ashley called me for the first time in months, her voice sweet with the particular kind of concern that appears when people need something. "Dot," she said, "I know we haven't talked much lately, but we're going through a really tough time right now. Marcus is working so hard to find something new. But until he does, we're struggling to keep up with everything." She didn't ask directly. Ashley was too smart for that. Instead, she painted a picture of Marcus's stress, of Tommy's needs, of a young family just trying to stay afloat during a difficult transition. She mentioned the possibility of losing their house, of having to move somewhere smaller, somewhere that might not be safe for a toddler. She talked about how hard it would be to start over, how much it would hurt Marcus's pride to feel like he had failed to provide for his family. I listened to every word, and my heart broke for my son. Not because he had lost his job, that was temporary, fixable, but because he was married to someone who had trained him to measure his worth by his ability to maintain her lifestyle. Marcus had always been resourceful, adaptable, the kind of person who could make the best of any situation. But Ashley had convinced him that anything less than what they currently had was failure. "What can I do to help?" I asked, because that's what grandmothers do. We help, we show up, we use whatever resources we have to make sure our families are safe and cared for. Ashley's relief was audible. She had been counting on exactly this response, banking on my love for Marcus and Tommy to override any hesitation I might have about bailing them out of a financial crisis they had created through their own choices. She explained that they needed help with their mortgage payments for a few months, just until Marcus found something new. She had already spoken to the bank about a loan extension, but they needed a co-signer with good credit and steady income. I didn't hesitate. I had the income from my pension and Social Security. I had good credit built over decades of careful financial management. I had savings I had planned to leave to Marcus anyway. If my resources could help my family through a crisis, then that's what they were for. I agreed to co-sign their loan extension that same day. But I also made a decision that would prove more important than any of us realized at the time. I decided to be more present in their lives during this difficult period. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, just available. If they were struggling, if Marcus was stressed, if Tommy needed extra attention while his parents navigated this challenge, then I wanted to be part of the solution. Ashley accepted my financial help with gratitude that felt genuine, if temporary. She accepted my increased presence with politeness that felt strained but manageable. What she didn't anticipate was that spending more time in their house would give me a clearer picture of who she really was when she thought no one important was watching. And Marcus, my beautiful, kind, overwhelmed son, was so focused on finding work and managing his anxiety about their future that he didn't notice how his wife spoke to his mother when she thought he was out of earshot. He didn't see the eye rolls, the heavy sighs, the way Ashley's entire demeanor changed the moment his back was turned. I noticed everything. I always had. 37 years of teaching had taught me to observe, to read the subtle signs that revealed what people were really thinking. And what I saw in Ashley during those weeks of increased contact was something that chilled me more than any financial crisis ever could. I saw who she really was, and she had no idea that the woman she was dismissing, the woman she was barely tolerating, the woman she was about to humiliate in ways that would change everything, was the same woman who held the key to keeping their house. That revelation was coming. But first, I had to live through the day when Ashley finally said out loud what she had been thinking about me for 3 years. The day she stopped pretending to be grateful and started being honest about how much she resented my existence in their lives. The day everything changed forever. The signs had been there all along, but I had chosen to interpret them charitably. When Ashley would suddenly stop talking the moment I entered a room, I told myself she was simply processing whatever conversation she'd been having with Marcus. When she would redirect Tommy's attention away from me during family gatherings, I assumed she was managing his energy levels. When she would schedule Tommy's naps to coincide perfectly with my planned visits, I convinced myself it was just an unfortunate coincidence. But charity has its limits, and mine were about to be tested in ways I never imagined possible. It started small, as these things often do. Ashley began making comments that felt like paper cuts, tiny wounds that stung but weren't quite significant, enough to address directly. She would mention how different parenting styles were now compared to the old days, with a pointed look in my direction when I suggested that Tommy might enjoy the same nursery rhymes that had delighted Marcus. She would talk about how important it was for children to have consistent messaging from their caregivers, implying that my old-fashioned ways might confuse her perfectly managed child. When I brought Tommy a wooden toy train set, the same kind Marcus had loved as a boy, Ashley examined it with the scrutiny of a quality control inspector. "Wood toys are having a moment again," she said, turning the engine over in her hands. "Though we're trying to keep his play environment more curated, too many toys can be overwhelming for developing minds." The train set disappeared into a closet, and when I asked about it weeks later, Ashley mentioned that they were rotating toys to prevent overstimulation. My homemade baby food, lovingly prepared from organic vegetables I grew in my own garden, was politely declined because Tommy was doing so well with the commercial brands that have been nutritionally optimized. My offer to teach Tommy simple songs and finger games was redirected because they had enrolled him in a structured music class that followed evidence-based early childhood development principles. Everything I offered was wrong somehow, too old-fashioned, too unscientific, too inconsistent with Ashley's vision of proper child-rearing. But the rejections were always wrapped in language that made them sound reasonable, even thoughtful. Ashley had perfected the art of dismissing people while making it seem like she was protecting them from their own outdated thinking. Marcus, caught between his wife's modern certainty and his mother's traditional warmth, tried to navigate the tension with the diplomatic skills that made him good at his job. He would gently suggest that maybe Ashley could be more flexible, that his mother's experience with children was valuable, that tradition and innovation could coexist. But these conversations always ended the same way, with Ashley explaining, patiently and thoroughly, why her approach was better for Tommy's development, why consistency was crucial, why too many different influences could be harmful. And Marcus, who loved his wife and trusted her judgment, who was already feeling vulnerable about his employment situation, would eventually agree that Ashley knew best. After all, she had read all the parenting books. She had researched child development extensively. She had strong opinions backed by what sounded like scientific evidence. How could he argue with that? The financial crisis intensified everything. As weeks turned into months without Marcus finding suitable employment, the stress in their household became palpable. Ashley, who had never experienced real financial insecurity, began to exhibit a brittleness that made every interaction feel fragile. She snapped at Marcus over small things, leaving dishes in the sink, forgetting to replace the toilet paper, playing with Tommy too loudly during what she had designated as quiet time. She also began to resent my increased presence in their lives. The loan extension I had co-signed had bought them time, but it had also created an obligation she clearly found burdensome. I was no longer just Marcus's mother, easily relegated to the margins of their life. I was now someone who had done them a significant favor, someone whose continued goodwill was essential to their financial stability. That shift in power dynamics made Ashley uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate but couldn't hide either. I started noticing how she would tense up when I arrived for my scheduled visits, how she would find reasons to leave the room when I was playing with Tommy, how she would interrupt our interactions with sudden needs. Tommy's diaper needed changing right now. He needed a snack at this exact moment. It was time for his educational screen time that couldn't be delayed. The breaking point came during what should have been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had arrived at my usual time to spend a couple of hours with Tommy, while Ashley worked on her laptop and Marcus sent out job applications. Tommy was going through a phase where he loved to play hiding games, giggling behind curtains and under furniture while I pretended not to know where he was. We were in the middle of such a game when Ashley's phone rang. It was her sister calling from California, and Ashley's demeanor immediately brightened in a way it never did when I was around. She moved to the kitchen to take the call, speaking in animated tones about career opportunities and weekend plans, her voice carrying the easy warmth she reserved for people she actually wanted to talk to. Tommy and I continued our game, but I couldn't help overhearing fragments of the conversation. Ashley was complaining about the stress of Marcus being unemployed, about the pressure of being the only one bringing in income, about how difficult it was to maintain their lifestyle under these circumstances. Her sister was apparently offering sympathy and advice because I heard Ashley say, I know, we're doing everything we can." Then her sister must have asked about family support because Ashley's voice took on a different tone. "Well, his mother helped with the loan extension," she said, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice, as if admitting to accepting help from me was embarrassing. But honestly, Jess, having her around all the time is becoming its own problem. I froze behind the couch where Tommy was hiding, my heart suddenly beating faster. Tommy giggled and tugged at my sleeve, but I held up a finger to shush him gently, straining to hear more. "She means well, I guess," Ashley continued, "but she's so intrusive. She has opinions about everything, how we feed Tommy, what toys he should play with, how we should be parenting him. And she's always here now, like she thinks co-signing that loan gives her the right to be involved in every aspect of our lives." The sister said something I couldn't make out, and Ashley laughed, a sharp, uncharitable sound that made my stomach clench. The worst part is that she doesn't even realize how inappropriate she's being. Like yesterday, she suggested that Tommy might be ready to start sleeping in a big boy bed because Marcus was potty trained early, as if what worked 30 years ago has any relevance to modern child development. And she keeps bringing him these homemade snacks that are probably full of sugar and preservatives, acting like she's doing us some huge favor. Another pause, another response from the sister. Marcus doesn't see it because he's got this whole sentimental thing about his childhood. But honestly, some of her habits are just gross. The woman is 73 years old, and I don't think she understands that her ideas about hygiene and child safety are completely outdated. Tommy came home from her house last week smelling like mothballs and old lady perfume, and when I gave him a bath, I found cat hair all over his clothes. My face burned with humiliation and anger. I didn't even own a cat. The old lady perfume was a light lavender lotion I had worn for years, the same scent Marcus used to say reminded him of comfort and home. The mothballs comment was particularly cruel. My house was impeccably clean, maintained with the same attention to detail I had brought to my classroom for nearly 4 decades. I just wish there was a way to get some space without making Marcus feel guilty about it, Ashley continued. But she's got us trapped right now because of the money situation. We can't exactly tell her to back off when she's basically keeping us from losing our house. Tommy had given up on our game and was now playing with blocks nearby, completely unaware that his mother was systematically destroying every positive feeling I had ever had about our relationship. I sat there behind the couch, frozen with the horrible realization that everything I had interpreted as reluctant tolerance was actually barely concealed disgust. The sister must have made some joke, because Ashley laughed again. God, can you imagine if I actually said what I was thinking? Thanks for the loan, Dorothy. But could you maybe shower before you come over and stop acting like you know better than actual parents who have read actual books about child development? That's when I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs. Ashley's tone immediately shifted. Oh, Marcus is coming down. I should go. But yes, let's definitely talk more about the San Diego job thing. Love you too. She hung up just as Marcus entered the kitchen, and I heard her greet him with the same cheerful voice she used when she wanted to project an image of domestic contentment. How did the phone interview go? I remained crouched behind the couch, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just heard. This wasn't just about different parenting philosophies or generational gaps. This was about fundamental disrespect, about a daughter-in-law who saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be valued. Tommy had wandered over to his toy kitchen and was pretending to cook, chattering to himself in the adorable way that toddlers do when they're engaged in imaginative play. I watched him, this beautiful child who was my greatest joy, and realized that Ashley was actively working to minimize my relationship with him. Not out of protectiveness, but out of embarrassment. She was ashamed of me, ashamed of my presence in their lives, ashamed that her perfect image required assistance from someone she considered beneath her standards. The conversation in the kitchen continued with Marcus describing his latest job interview, Ashley offering encouragement and advice. They sounded like any married couple navigating a difficult period together, supporting each other through challenges and setbacks. But I now knew that Ashley's support came with conditions, that her patience had limits, that her love for Marcus didn't extend to tolerance for the people who had shaped him. I eventually emerged from behind the couch and rejoined Tommy's play, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every few minutes, Ashley would glance over from the kitchen with what I now recognized as barely concealed irritation. When Tommy brought me a book to read, she interrupted to remind him that it was almost time for his educational video. When he climbed into my lap for a cuddle, she suggested that maybe he needed some independent playtime to develop his autonomy. I left earlier than usual that day, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fictional. Ashley's relief was poorly concealed behind polite expressions of concern. "Feel better, Dorothy," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We'll see you next week." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Ashley's phone conversation over and over. The casual cruelty of her words stung, but what hurt more was the realization that Marcus had no idea who his wife really was. He saw her carefully curated public persona, the devoted mother, the supportive wife, the woman who had graciously accepted help from his family during a difficult time. He had no idea that she privately mocked the woman who had raised him, that she found my presence so distasteful, she complained about it to her sister like it was a burden she was forced to endure. I had always prided myself on being a good judge of character. 37 years of teaching had given me plenty of practice reading people, understanding motivations, seeing through facades. But I had wanted so desperately to love Ashley, to be part of Marcus's new family, that I had ignored every instinct. That told me something was wrong. The next few weeks passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I continued my scheduled visits, but now every interaction felt contaminated by the knowledge of what Ashley really thought about me. When she complimented Tommy's behavior after spending time with me, I knew she was probably attributing it to her own parenting rather than giving me any credit. When she thanked me for watching him while she ran errands, I knew she was calculating the minimum amount of gratitude required to keep me cooperative. Marcus remained oblivious, caught up in the stress of job hunting and financial pressure. He was grateful for my help, genuinely appreciative of the loan extension that was keeping their house payments current. But he was also distracted, overwhelmed, not paying attention to the subtle dynamics playing out in his own home. The final straw came 3 weeks after the phone call incident. It was another Tuesday afternoon, and I had brought Tommy a new book, a collection of classic children's stories that I thought he might enjoy. Ashley accepted it with the same polite smile she used for everything I offered, but I noticed she placed it on a high shelf rather than reading it with him. I was playing blocks with Tommy on the living room floor when Ashley's friend Sarah stopped by unexpectedly. Sarah was another young mother from Tommy's daycare, someone Ashley had mentioned as being particularly knowledgeable about child development and educational toys. I had met her briefly at a few social events and found her pleasant enough, though she shared Ashley's tendency to speak about parenting like it was a complex science that required advanced degrees to understand properly. Ashley invited Sarah to stay for coffee, and they settled at the kitchen table while Tommy and I continued playing in the adjacent living room. At first, their conversation was the typical exchange of information about their children: sleep, schedules, developmental milestones, preschool applications. But gradually, it shifted to more personal territory. How are things going with Marcus's job search? Sarah asked, her voice pitched low but not quite low enough to be private. Slowly, Ashley replied with a sigh. It's been really stressful for both of us. We're managing, but it's definitely not how we pictured this year going. I can't imagine, Sarah said sympathetically. At least you have family support. That must help with some of the pressure. There was a pause, and I could practically feel Ashley's internal debate about how much to reveal. It does and it doesn't, she said finally. Marcus's mother has been very generous financially, which we're grateful for. But having her so involved in our daily routine has been challenging. Tommy had lost interest in the blocks and wandered over to his bookshelf, pulling out several picture books and bringing them back to where I was sitting. I helped him stack them into a tower, listening to the conversation in the kitchen with growing dread. Challenging how? Sarah prompted. Ashley lowered her voice further, but not far enough. She's just very old school about everything. Different ideas about child rearing, different standards for, well, everything. And she doesn't really seem to understand boundaries. Like, I'll come home from work and find that she's rearranged Tommy's toys or started feeding him snacks without checking with me first. Oh, that's tough, Sarah agreed. It's so hard when grandparents have different approaches. My mother-in-law is the same way, always suggesting things that worked back in her day, without realizing how much we've learned about child development since then. Exactly, Ashley said, her voice warming with the validation. And the hygiene thing is becoming a real issue. I don't want to be mean, but she's older, and I don't think she realizes that some of her habits aren't appropriate around a toddler anymore. Tommy comes home from visits with her smelling like old lady house, and yesterday I found food stains on his shirt that had obviously been there for a while. My face burned with humiliation. I was meticulous about cleanliness, obsessive about Tommy's safety and comfort when he was in my care. The food stains she was referring to were probably from the organic applesauce I had made for him, a small smudge that I had missed during cleanup. The old lady house smell was likely the potpourri I kept in my living room, a light floral scent that had never bothered anyone else. That's so awkward, Sarah said. Have you talked to Marcus about it? I've tried, but he gets defensive about his mother, which I understand. She's family, and she's helping us financially right now. But it's like he can't see what I'm seeing, you know? He remembers her as this perfect mom from his childhood, and he can't acknowledge that she's just different now. Tommy had rebuilt his tower and was now pretending to be a monster who would knock it down. His delighted squeals filled the living room as blocks scattered across the floor. Normally, his joy would have been infectious, but today I felt numb, hollowed out by the casual cruelty of Ashley's words. Maybe it'll get better once he finds work and things settle down, Sarah suggested. Sometimes financial stress makes everything else feel more intense. Maybe, Ashley agreed, but she didn't sound optimistic. I just wish there was a way to create some healthy distance without seeming ungrateful. But right now, we're kind of stuck. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I had heard enough. Tommy had wandered over to me and was trying to climb into my lap, probably sensing my distress in the way children often do. I lifted him up and held him close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair and trying to process what I had just learned. Ashley wasn't just tolerating my presence out of politeness or family obligation. She was actively resenting it, finding fault with everything I did, criticizing my character and my capabilities to her friends. The financial help I had provided hadn't earned me gratitude. It had made me a burden she felt trapped into accepting. When Sarah left an hour later, Ashley returned to the living room with a bright smile that felt like a slap. "How are my favorite guys doing?" she asked, reaching for Tommy with the possessive affection she always displayed when other people were around. "We're having a wonderful time," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "Tommy's been such a good boy." "He always is with Grandma," Ashley said, and for the first time I heard the subtle condescension in her tone. It wasn't a compliment, it was a dismissal, a way of minimizing my influence by making it sound like Tommy's good behavior was just something that happened naturally rather than something I actively encouraged. I left shortly after that, claiming I had errands to run. Ashley didn't argue or try to extend my visit, confirming what I now knew to be true. She was counting the minutes until I was gone. The drive home felt longer than usual, filled with the kind of heavy silence that comes after a profound disappointment. I had spent 3 years trying to love a woman who found me disgusting. I had opened my heart, my home, and my bank account to people who saw me as an inconvenience to be managed. I had co-signed a loan extension for a daughter-in-law who complained about my hygiene to her friends. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to understand how I had gotten here. How had I become someone my own family was embarrassed by? When had my love become something they tolerated rather than treasured? How had I failed to see that Ashley's politeness was just a performance designed to keep me cooperative until they no longer needed my help? The answers weren't complicated. I had seen what I wanted to see instead of what was really there. I had made excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable. I had prioritized keeping peace over maintaining dignity. I had been so desperate to be part of Marcus's new family that I had allowed myself to be treated like a second-class citizen in my own grandson's life. But recognition was just the first step. The real question was what I intended to do about it. I pulled out my checkbook and looked at the recent entries. The loan extension payment that had gone through just the week before, another month of keeping Ashley and Marcus in their perfect house while she talked about me like I was a hygiene problem that needed to be solved. For the first time in months, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I was finally, completely clear about what needed to happen next. Ashley thought she had me trapped by my love for Marcus and Tommy, by my desire to be helpful, by my fear of causing family conflict. She thought my financial contribution had made me invested in their success, that I would continue to tolerate her disrespect, rather than risk damaging my relationship with my son. She had miscalculated, badly, because the same woman who had taught rebellious teenagers for nearly 4 decades, who had managed classroom dynamics and parent conferences and administrative politics with quiet authority, was not someone who could be dismissed indefinitely. I had simply been choosing not to use my power. But choices can change, and mine was about to change in ways that would surprise everyone, especially Ashley, who had no idea that the woman she found so distasteful was also the woman who held the key to everything she thought she had secured. The reckoning was coming. But first, I had some phone calls to make. The confrontation I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire life came on a Thursday morning in late September. I had arrived at Marcus and Ashley's house at my usual time, bringing fresh muffins I had baked the night before and a small wooden puzzle I thought Tommy might enjoy. The morning started like any other, with Ashley greeting me at the door with her practiced smile and Tommy running to wrap his arms around my legs in the genuine affection that still made my heart soar. Marcus had left early for a promising job interview at an architectural firm downtown, his first real prospect in months. Ashley seemed lighter than usual, probably because the possibility of Marcus finding work meant she could start planning my gradual removal from their daily routine. She had been dropping hints lately about how nice it would be when things got back to normal, when they could regain their independence and establish better boundaries with extended family. I settled into my usual spot on the living room floor with Tommy, who was going through a phase where he loved to sort objects by color and size. We had created an elaborate game where different colored blocks represented different animals, and we would build zoos and farms together while he practiced counting and naming colors. It was exactly the kind of old-fashioned, unstructured play that Ashley disapproved of, But Tommy thrived during these sessions, his vocabulary expanding daily, and his confidence growing with each small accomplishment. Ashley had positioned herself at the kitchen table with her laptop, ostensibly working on a marketing campaign, but actually monitoring our interaction with the vigilance of a security guard. I had learned to recognize the signs of her surveillance, the way she would pause in her typing when Tommy laughed too loudly, the way she would glance over whenever I suggested a new variation to our games, the way she would find reasons to interrupt whenever Tommy seemed too engaged with what we were doing. About an hour into our play session, Ashley's phone rang. I could see her checking the caller ID, and her face immediately brightened in a way that told me this was someone she actually wanted to talk to. She answered with the warm, animated voice she reserved for her real friends and family members. "Rebecca, oh my God, I was just thinking about you. How was the conference in Chicago?" Rebecca was Ashley's college roommate, now living in Portland with her husband and 2 young children. From previous conversations I had overheard, Rebecca worked in the same marketing field as Ashley and shared her strong opinions about evidence-based parenting and modern child development theories. They spoke regularly and seemed to view each other as authorities on everything from career advancement to proper nutrition for toddlers. Ashley moved toward the sliding glass door that led to their back patio, clearly intending to take the call outside where she could speak more freely. But Tommy chose that moment to knock over his carefully constructed block tower, sending colorful pieces scattering across the hardwood floor with a crash that echoed through the house. "Oh, shoot!" Ashley said into the phone. "Hang on 1 second. Tommy just made a huge mess." She walked over to where we were playing, surveying the scattered blocks with the expression of someone who had just discovered a significant inconvenience. Tommy was already starting to pick up the pieces, chattering happily about rebuilding his tower. But Ashley's focus was on regaining control of the situation so she could return to her phone call. "Dorothy, would you mind getting him started on something quieter?" she asked, her hand covering the phone's mouthpiece. "I really need to take this call, and Rebecca has limited time between meetings." I nodded and began helping Tommy gather the blocks, suggesting we build something new in whispered tones so we wouldn't disturb Ashley's conversation. But Ashley lingered for a moment, torn between her desire to talk to Rebecca and her compulsive need to supervise every aspect of Tommy's activities. "Actually," she said, uncovering the phone briefly, "Rebecca, let me call you back in just a few minutes. I need to get Tommy settled with a proper activity." I looked up from where I was kneeling on the floor, blocks scattered around me like confetti. "Ashley, we're fine here. Go ahead and take your call. Tommy and I can play quietly." But Ashley had already hung up, her expression shifting to the barely controlled irritation I had become familiar with over the past few months. She surveyed the living room, the scattered toys, the puzzle pieces spread across the coffee table, the muffins I had brought sitting on a plate that didn't match her usual dinnerware aesthetic. "You know what?" she said, her voice taking on the strained quality that appeared when she was trying to maintain politeness while feeling overwhelmed. "Maybe this isn't the best time for a visit. Marcus is at that interview. I've got this important work call to return, and Tommy's been extra energetic today. Sometimes too much stimulation can make him cranky later." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Are you asking me to leave?" "Not asking," Ashley said quickly. "Just suggesting that maybe we could reschedule for a day when there's less going on. You understand?" Tommy looked up from his blocks, sensing the tension in the room with the emotional radar that small children possess. He abandoned the blocks and climbed into my lap, wrapping his small arms around my neck in a gesture that felt both comforting and protective. "Grandma, stay," he said firmly, using the clear, decisive tone he had recently learned for expressing preferences. "Grandma, play blocks." Ashley's expression tightened. "Tommy, sweetie, Grandma needs to go home now. She'll come back another day." "No," Tommy said, his grip around my neck tightening. "Grandma, stay. Play animals." I could see Ashley's patience evaporating in real time. This was exactly the kind of scene she worked so hard to avoid. A toddler asserting preferences that contradicted her plans, a disruption to the controlled environment she had spent months creating. But instead of handling the situation with the understanding that any experienced parent or caregiver would show, she seemed to view Tommy's attachment to me as a direct challenge to her authority. "Tommy," she said, her voice sharpening, "Grandma is going to leave now. You can play with your toys by yourself for a little while, and then we'll do something special together." Tommy's response was to burrow deeper into my arms, making the soft whimpering sounds that preceded a full meltdown. I could feel his little body tensing with the confusion that comes when toddlers are asked to understand adult conflicts they haven't created and can't solve. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered to him, stroking his hair. "Grandma's not going anywhere right now." That's when Ashley snapped. "Actually, Dorothy, I think you are going somewhere right now," she said, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You undermine my parenting decisions. You get him all worked up with inappropriate activities, and then you act like you have more authority in this house than I do." I stared at her, holding Tommy closer as her words hit me like physical blows. "Ashley, I was just trying to help. Tommy was having fun." And I thought, "That's the problem," she interrupted, her voice rising. You think you know better than his actual parents. You think your outdated ideas about childcare are more valuable than the research-based approaches we've chosen. You think being here twice a week gives you the right to contradict my decisions about my own child?" Tommy had gone very still in my arms, the way children do when they sense danger they don't understand. I could feel his heart beating fast against my chest, and I knew that whatever happened next, I needed to protect him from witnessing a full confrontation between his mother and his grandmother. "Maybe we should discuss this when Tommy isn't here," I said quietly, trying to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. But Ashley was beyond caring about Tommy's presence. Months of forced politeness, financial obligation, and suppressed resentment had finally found their outlet, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity to say everything she had been thinking. "You know what, Dorothy? I'm tired of pretending. This is working. I'm tired of scheduling my life around your visits, tired of cleaning up after your messy activities, tired of dealing with Tommy being confused because you do things completely differently than we do them." She moved closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "And I'm really tired of having to pretend I don't notice that you smell like old people and mothballs, and that your house smells the same way, and that Tommy comes home from visits with you needing a bath because he picks up that smell." The words hit me like a physical assault. Everything I had overheard during her phone conversations, all the criticisms she had shared with her friends, all the judgments she had been harboring were finally being said directly to my face. But hearing them out loud, in front of Tommy, with such venom and deliberate cruelty, was worse than I had imagined possible. "That's enough," I said, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. "No, it's not enough," Ashley continued, emboldened by finally being able to speak her truth. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this has been? Having to explain to our friends why Marcus's elderly mother is here all the time, why she thinks she has input on how we raise our child, why we can't establish normal boundaries because she's financially involved in our lives." Tommy started crying then, soft, hiccuping sobs that broke my heart. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the anger, the rejection, the way his mother was trying to make his grandmother disappear. I stood up slowly, holding him against my shoulder and patting his back with the automatic comfort gestures that come from decades of caring for children. "You're upsetting him," I said. "I'm upsetting him?" Ashley's voice rose again. "You're the one who gets him all attached and then acts surprised when he doesn't want you to leave. You create these problems and then blame everyone else for the consequences." I looked at this woman, this person my son had chosen to marry and build a life with, and saw her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as someone who was stressed or overwhelmed or struggling to adjust to having extended family involved in her life, but as someone who was fundamentally selfish, someone who viewed relationships as transactions that needed to benefit her, someone who was capable of extraordinary cruelty when she felt her control was threatened. "Ashley," I said, "I think you need to take a step back and think about what you're saying." "I've been thinking about what I'm saying for months," she shot back. "I just haven't been saying it because Marcus gets all defensive about his precious mother. But you know what? Maybe it's time he heard the truth about how this arrangement is actually working for the people who have to live with it every day." She pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly, her fingers flying across the screen with the efficiency of someone who had been composing this message in her head for a long time. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Texting Marcus," she said, without looking up. "Telling him that this situation has become untenable and that we need to have a serious conversation about boundaries when he gets home." Tommy's crying had escalated to the wailing that signals a complete emotional breakdown. He was calling for his daddy, for his mommy, for his grandma, not understanding why the adults in his world were suddenly angry and why the comfortable routine of his Thursday morning had exploded into chaos. I made a decision that would change everything. "Give me your phone," I said. Ashley looked up, startled by the authority in my voice. "What?" "Give me your phone. If you're going to text my son about this situation, you're going to do it with complete honesty. You're going to tell him exactly what you just said to me, and you're going to let him decide how he wants to handle it." "I don't have to give you anything," Ashley said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. She had expected me to retreat, to apologize, to absorb her abuse, and then quietly leave so she could control the narrative when Marcus returned home. "You're absolutely right," I said, still holding the sobbing Tommy against my shoulder. "You don't have to give me anything, just like I don't have to continue co-signing loan extensions for people who find my presence so disgusting." The color drained from Ashley's face. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to realize that her financial security might be connected to the woman she had just finished humiliating. "Dorothy, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "You meant every word. And that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions about me, about my hygiene, about my outdated approaches to childcare. But you're not entitled to my financial support while you're expressing those opinions." I moved toward the door, still carrying Tommy, who had calmed slightly but was still sniffling against my shoulder. Ashley followed, her phone forgotten in her hand, her face showing the first signs of panic. "Wait, you can't just leave. Tommy's upset and Marcus will be home soon, and we need to talk about this like adults." I turned back to her, and for a moment I felt sorry for her. Not because she was wrong about what she had said, but because she was so young, so certain that the world would continue to arrange itself around her preferences, so convinced that other people would always prioritize her comfort over their own dignity. "Ashley," I said, "you just told me that I smell bad, that my house smells bad, that I'm an embarrassment to your social circle, and that my presence in your life is something you have to endure rather than appreciate. Those aren't the words of someone who wants to talk like adults. Those are the words of someone who has been pretending to be grateful while actually being disgusted." I kissed Tommy's forehead and handed him to her, despite his protests and reaching arms. "Tell Marcus I'll talk to him later. But not here, and not while you're managing the conversation." I walked toward my car, leaving Ashley standing in the doorway holding a crying toddler, and finally understanding that actions have consequences, that financial partnerships can be dissolved, and that the woman she had just systematically insulted was also the woman who held the power to destroy the comfortable life she had been taking for granted. The drive home passed in a blur of anger, hurt, and crystallizing determination. I had spent 3 years trying to earn Ashley's love, or at least her respect. I had modified my behavior, suppressed my instincts, and accepted treatment that I would never have tolerated from anyone else, all because I wanted to be part of my son's family. But there comes a moment in every relationship when you have to choose between being loved and being respected, between keeping peace and maintaining dignity. Ashley had made it clear that she would never respect me, that my presence in her life would always be something she tolerated rather than treasured. That was her choice to make. But the choice about whether to continue enabling her lifestyle while she treated me like a burden was mine. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for several minutes, letting the full weight of what had just happened settle into my bones. Ashley had finally said out loud what I had been sensing for months. She found me disgusting. She was embarrassed by me. She viewed my relationship with Tommy as inappropriate interference rather than loving involvement. More than that, she had said these things in front of Tommy, creating confusion and distress for a child who had done nothing wrong except love his grandmother. That level of selfishness, that willingness to traumatize a toddler in order to make her point, revealed something about Ashley's character that I could never forgive or forget. Inside my house, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with the phone number for the bank written on a piece of paper in front of me. The loan extension I had co-signed was keeping Ashley and Marcus in their house, maintaining the lifestyle that Ashley felt entitled to, providing the security that allowed her to treat me like an inconvenience. But co-signing meant I had the power to withdraw that support, legally, ethically, completely. I thought about Marcus, about how this decision would affect him, about the stress and disappointment he would feel when he discovered that his financial safety net had been removed. I thought about Tommy, about how the upheaval in his parents' lives would impact his sense of security and routine. But mostly I thought about dignity, about self-respect, about the difference between helping people you love and enabling people who abuse that love. I thought about the message I would be sending to Tommy about how people should treat their elders, about what kind of behavior was acceptable in families, about whether love meant accepting disrespect or demanding better. Ashley had gambled that my love for Marcus and Tommy would keep me trapped in a relationship where I was valued only for my financial contribution. She had assumed that I would continue to absorb her contempt rather than risk disrupting their lives. She had been wrong. I picked up the phone and dialed the bank's customer service line. When the representative answered, I spoke clearly and calmly. "This is Dorothy Henderson. I need to discuss removing myself as a co-signer from a loan extension I guaranteed for my son and daughter-in-law." The process took less than an hour. Forms to be faxed, signatures to be notarized, phone calls to confirm my identity and intent. By late afternoon, I was no longer financially responsible for Ashley and Marcus's mortgage payments. More importantly, they were no longer eligible for the extension that was keeping them current on their payments. The bank representative explained that they would receive notification within 24 hours, that they would have 30 days to secure alternative financing or begin working with the bank on modified payment arrangements. It was all very professional, very legal, very final. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen as the afternoon light faded, thinking about consequences and choices and the difference between revenge and justice. I wasn't trying to hurt Marcus or Tommy. I was simply refusing to be hurt anymore myself. Ashley had wanted me out of their lives. Now she would get her wish, completely and permanently. But the woman she had found so distasteful was also the woman who had been keeping them financially afloat. She couldn't have one without the other. My phone rang around dinner time. Marcus's number appeared on the caller ID, and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. By the time I finally answered, he had called 6 times. "Mom," he said, his voice strained with panic and confusion. "What happened today?" "Ashley is upset. Tommy's been crying all afternoon, and I just got a call from the bank saying something about the loan extension being canceled. I don't understand what's going on." "Marcus," I said, I need you to ask Ashley to tell you exactly what she said to me this morning, word for word. And then I need you to think about whether you want to be married to someone who would say those things to your mother." There was a long pause. "Mom, whatever happened, I'm sure we can work it out. Ashley said you two had a misunderstanding, but she's willing to apologize if—" "Ask her to tell you what she said," I repeated. Not her version of what happened, the actual words she used, and then call me back. I hung up and turned off my phone. Whatever conversation Marcus and Ashley were about to have needed to happen without my input or interference. Either Marcus would recognize that his wife had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, or he would choose to protect her behavior and minimize my experience. Either way, I would know where I stood. And for the first time in 3 years, I would be standing on solid ground, with my dignity intact and my choices made from a position of strength rather than hope. The reckoning had begun. But I was no longer waiting for other people to determine my worth or my place in my own family. I had remembered something I had forgotten during all those months of trying to earn Ashley's approval. I was Dorothy Henderson, a woman who had commanded respect from hundreds of students and parents over nearly 4 decades of teaching. I was someone who had raised a good man, built a stable life, and contributed meaningfully to my community. I deserved better than what Ashley had been offering, and now I was going to insist on it. The silence in my house that evening felt different than the loneliness I had grown accustomed to over the years since my husband's death. This wasn't the empty quiet of being alone. It was the purposeful stillness of someone who had finally stopped waiting for other people to determine their worth. I made myself a simple dinner, organized some papers that had been sitting on my desk for weeks, and settled into my favorite reading chair with a mystery novel I had been meaning to finish. Every few minutes, my phone would buzz with another call from Marcus. I could see his name lighting up the screen, could imagine his growing frustration as each call went to voicemail, but I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet. Whatever conversation Ashley was having with him about the morning's events needed to happen without my influence. She would either tell him the truth about what she had said to me, or she would spin a version of events that made her the victim and me the unreasonable aggressor. Either way, I would learn something important about both of them. Around 9 o'clock, my landline rang. I had forgotten that Marcus still had that number, hadn't thought to turn off that phone as well. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in the persistence of the ringing made me pick up. "Mom." Marcus's voice was strained in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager dealing with his first heartbreak. "Please don't hang up. I need to understand what happened today." "Did you ask Ashley to tell you exactly what she said to me?" There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that contains entire conversations. I did. And another pause. "She said you two had a disagreement about Tommy's activities, and that maybe some things were said in the heat of the moment that didn't come out right." I closed my eyes, not surprised, but still disappointed. Ashley was going to control the narrative, minimize her cruelty, and force Marcus to choose between believing his wife's sanitized version of events or accepting that he had married someone capable of the kind of calculated meanness I had experienced. "Marcus," I said carefully, "did she tell you that she said I smell bad? That my house smells bad? That I'm an embarrassment to her social circle? That she's tired of pretending she doesn't notice that Tommy needs a bath after spending time with me because he picks up my smell?" The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She didn't say it like that." "How did she say it?" "She said that maybe there had been some generational differences about hygiene standards, and that she was worried about Tommy being exposed to different environments without proper precautions." I almost laughed at the clinical language Ashley had used to transform her vicious personal attack into something that sounded like a reasonable health concern. She was even more skilled at manipulation than I had realized, capable of taking her moment of revealed cruelty and repackaging it as thoughtful parenting. Marcus, I need you to think very carefully about what you're going to say next, because it will determine our relationship going forward. Do you believe that version of events? Mom, I think there's probably some truth in both versions. Ashley's been under a lot of stress with my job situation, and maybe she didn't express herself as well as she could have. But you've also been pretty involved in our daily routine lately, and maybe some boundaries got blurred. There it was. Marcus was choosing to believe his wife's reframed version of events, choosing to split the difference between her calculated cruelty and my hurt feelings, choosing to make this a conflict between two unreasonable women, rather than acknowledging that one of them had behaved unforgivably. I see, I said, and I did see, more clearly than I had in months. Marcus wasn't going to protect me from Ashley's treatment. He wasn't going to demand that his wife show basic respect to his mother. He was going to manage the situation by asking everyone to compromise, which meant asking me to accept being treated poorly in exchange for limited access to my grandson. Mom, the bank called about the loan extension. Can we talk about that? I know you're upset, but pulling your support is going to put us in a really difficult position. And there was the heart of it. Marcus was more concerned about the financial consequences of my decision than he was about the emotional abuse that had prompted it. He was ready to negotiate my tolerance of his wife's disrespect in exchange for my continued financial support. Marcus, I love you. I have loved you every day of your life, and I will continue to love you no matter what choices you make. But I will not continue to provide financial support to people who treat me with contempt. And I will not pretend to have a relationship with a daughter-in-law who finds my presence disgusting. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, Mom. We can work out better boundaries, clearer expectations. Ashley's willing to apologize for how things came across today. Is she willing to apologize for what she actually said, or just for how it came across? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I think she's genuinely sorry that you were hurt. Sorry that I was hurt. Not sorry for hurting me. Not regretful about her words or behavior. Just sorry that I had been hurt, as if my pain was an unfortunate side effect of her necessary honesty, rather than the direct result of her deliberate cruelty. That's not the same thing, Marcus. Mom, please, we need your help right now. I'm still looking for work, and without the loan extension, we're going to lose the house. Tommy's going to lose his home, his stability, everything familiar. Is that really what you want? The emotional manipulation was subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus was asking me to prioritize Tommy's immediate comfort over my own dignity, to enable Ashley's behavior by absorbing the financial consequences of standing up to her. He was suggesting that my refusal to be mistreated would hurt an innocent child, making me responsible for whatever hardships might follow. But I had spent enough years working with children to understand that stability isn't just about maintaining familiar physical environments. It's about knowing that the adults in your life treat each other with respect, that love doesn't require accepting unacceptable behavior, that boundaries exist to protect everyone's well-being. Marcus, what I want is for my grandson to grow up understanding that people who love you don't speak to you the way Ashley spoke to me today. What I want is for him to see that his grandmother has enough self-respect not to accept being treated like a burden while providing financial support to the people who see her that way. You're being dramatic, Mom. Ashley doesn't see you as a burden. She's just protective of her family and her parenting choices. Protective of her family. As if I weren't family. As if my relationship with Tommy was some kind of outside threat, rather than a natural bond between a grandmother and grandchild. Marcus had internalized Ashley's view of our family structure, where she and he and Tommy constituted the real family, and I was an external presence who needed to be managed and contained. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. When you think about Tommy's childhood, do you see me as part of his family, or as someone who visits his family? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Of course, You're part of his family. You're his grandmother. That's not what I asked. I asked whether you see me as part of his family, or as someone who visits his family. This time the silence was longer, more thoughtful. When Marcus spoke again, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. I guess I see you as someone who's very important to him, who he loves spending time with, who has a special relationship with him, but not as part of his family. Mom, you know that's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, Marcus, and it's what Ashley has meant from the beginning. I'm not Tommy's family. I'm not your family. I'm someone who can be useful when you need financial help or babysitting, but whose opinions about child rearing are outdated, whose presence in your home is something to be managed, and whose feelings are less important than maintaining peace with your wife. That's not fair. You're right, it's not fair, but it's accurate. I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, asking what was happening, whether I was going to help them with the house payments. Even in crisis, she was more concerned about the financial implications than about repairing the relationship she had damaged. Mom, can we please just table this for now and focus on the practical stuff? The bank says we have 30 days to come up with alternative financing or they'll start foreclosure proceedings. If you could just extend the co-signing for another few months while I find work, we can deal with the other issues later. Deal with the other issues later, as if my self-respect was an issue to be dealt with, rather than a fundamental requirement for any ongoing relationship. As if Ashley's treatment of me was a minor problem that could be addressed once their financial crisis was resolved. Marcus, I'm going to say this once, very clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. I will not co-sign another loan for you, and Ashley, I will not provide financial support to your family as long as Ashley is part of it. And I will not have a relationship with any of you that requires me to pretend that what happened today was acceptable. You're really going to destroy our family over a misunderstanding? I'm not destroying anything, Marcus. I'm refusing to pretend that being systematically disrespected by your wife is a misunderstanding. I'm refusing to provide financial support to people who view my presence as a burden. I'm choosing to have enough self-respect not to beg for scraps of affection from people who should love me unconditionally. What am I supposed to tell Ashley? What am I supposed to tell Tommy when he asks where Grandma is? The questions revealed everything I needed to know about Marcus's priorities. He wasn't asking how he could repair the damage Ashley had done, or how he could ensure that his mother was treated with respect going forward. He was asking how he could manage the fallout from my decision to stand up for myself. Tell Ashley that actions have consequences. Tell Tommy that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and that Grandma loves him but won't be visiting for a while because his mommy said some very unkind things. Mom, please don't put me in the middle of this. You're not in the middle, Marcus. You're on Ashley's side, which is where you should be. She's your wife. But don't pretend you're neutral when you've already decided that my feelings matter less than her comfort. I hung up before he could respond, turned off both phones, and sat in my quiet house thinking about the cost of dignity and the price of peace. Marcus would have to figure out how to save his house without my help. Ashley would have to learn that treating people cruelly sometimes results in losing their support. Tommy would have to adjust to not seeing his grandmother while his parents dealt with the consequences of their choices. None of this felt good. None of it felt like victory. But it felt like truth. And truth, even when it's painful, is more valuable than the comfortable lies I had been living with for 3 years. The next few days passed in a strange cocoon of calm determination. I went about my normal routines: grocery shopping, library visits, volunteer work at the community center, but with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't waiting for my phone to ring with Ashley's schedule for visits. I wasn't planning activities around Tommy's nap times or preparing snacks that met Ashley's nutritional standards. I wasn't bracing myself for subtle criticisms or managing my behavior to avoid triggering Ashley's disapproval. For the first time in years, my time was entirely my own. On Saturday morning, I was working in my garden when my neighbor Helen came over with a cup of coffee and the concerned expression of someone who had something difficult to say. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay with Marcus and his family?" I saw Ashley drive by yesterday, and she looked pretty upset. Helen was a retired nurse who had lived next door for 15 years. We had developed the kind of friendship that exists between people who respect each other's privacy, but care enough to check in during difficult times. She knew about the loan extension I had co-signed, knew about my regular visits with Tommy, knew enough about the family dynamics to recognize when something significant had changed. "We've had some differences of opinion about family boundaries," I said carefully. "I've decided to step back from being so involved in their daily routine." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I've been wondering about that situation for a while, to be honest. Ashley always seemed a bit intense about managing things." "What do you mean?" "Well, you know how you can sometimes hear conversations when people are in their driveway? I couldn't help but notice that she seemed to have very strong opinions about how often you visited, how long you stayed, what kinds of activities were appropriate for Tommy. It struck me as odd that a mother would be so controlling about her child's relationship with his grandmother." I looked at Helen with surprise. I had assumed that my struggles with Ashley were invisible to outside observers, that the careful politeness we maintained in public concealed the tension that existed in private. But apparently, Ashley's need to control every aspect of Tommy's life, including his relationship with me, had been noticeable to others. "Did it seem strange to you that she would be so particular about those things?" Helen set down her coffee cup and chose her words carefully. "Dorothy, I raised 4 children, and I had very involved mothers-in-law with all of them. Some I got along with better than others, and there were certainly times when I felt like boundaries needed to be established. But I never would have tried to limit my children's relationships with their grandparents unless there was a serious safety concern." She paused, looking at me with the direct gaze of someone who had made a decision to speak honestly. Ashley always struck me as someone who wanted to control the narrative about her family. Everything had to look perfect, be perfect, meet her exact specifications. That's not necessarily wrong, but it doesn't leave much room for the kind of messiness that comes with extended family relationships. The messiness? You know, different generations having different ideas about childcare, grandparents spoiling grandchildren a little bit, families gathering for holidays where not everyone gets along perfectly, but everyone tries because they love each other. Real family stuff. Helen's words crystallized something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. Ashley didn't just want boundaries, she wanted control. She wanted to be the sole architect of Tommy's childhood, the primary influence on his development, the gatekeeper who determined which relationships were valuable and which were problematic. "I think you're right," I said. "And I think I finally realized that trying to earn approval from someone who sees love as a threat was never going to work." "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to live my life. I'm going to volunteer. More at the community center. Maybe take that pottery class I've been thinking about. I'm going to read books and tend my garden and stop organizing my schedule around people who don't actually want me around." Helen smiled. "That sounds like a very healthy decision." That afternoon, I drove to the community center and signed up for 3 different volunteer opportunities: helping with literacy programs for adults, organizing activities for senior citizens, and assisting with after-school programs for elementary students. If I couldn't be a meaningful part of my own grandson's life, I could at least contribute to other children's lives in ways that were valued and appreciated. The program coordinator, an energetic woman named Maria, was delighted to have an experienced educator join their team. "We especially need help with the after-school program," she said. "A lot of these kids don't have involved grandparents, and they really respond to older adults who take an interest in their lives." Walking through the after-school program that evening, Watching 7- and 8-year-olds work on homework and art projects under the supervision of volunteers who clearly cared about their progress, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: usefulness without strings attached, appreciation without conditions, the simple joy of being valued for what I could offer rather than tolerated for what I could provide. One little boy, maybe 7 years old, was struggling with a reading assignment. His volunteer tutor was patient but clearly frustrated by his resistance to phonics exercises. I sat down beside them and listened to him try to sound out words, recognizing immediately that he was a visual learner who was being taught through auditory methods. "Can I try something?" I asked the tutor. She nodded gratefully. I found some index cards and markers and helped the boy create picture cards for the words he was struggling with. Within 15 minutes, he was reading sentences that had been impossible for him just moments before. His face lit up with the joy that comes from sudden understanding, and he wanted to show everyone what he could do. "How did you know to try?" "That?" the tutor asked. 37 years of teaching," I said. "You learn to recognize different learning styles." Driving home that night, I realized that this was what I had been missing in my relationship with Ashley and Marcus. The sense that my experience was valuable, that my contributions mattered, that I had something worth offering. Ashley had spent 3 years telling me that my approaches were outdated, my ideas were irrelevant, my presence was more burden than blessing. But that little boy's breakthrough reminded me that wisdom doesn't become worthless just because it's not trendy. My phone was ringing when I got home. Marcus again, the 4th call since our conversation 3 days earlier. This time I answered. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over?" "Are you coming alone?" "Yes. Ashley's at her sister's for the weekend. She needed some space to think about everything that's happened." Ashley needed space to think, not space to feel sorry for what she had said, or space to figure out how to make amends, but space to think. Probably space to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond her management. "You can come over," I said. "But Marcus, I need you to understand that I'm not negotiating about the loan extension. That decision is final." "I know. I'm not coming to argue about money. I just want to talk to my mom." An hour later, Marcus was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of the coffee I had been making for him since he was old enough to drink it. He looked older than his 34 years, worn down by months of unemployment stress, and the realization that his carefully constructed life was falling apart in ways he couldn't control. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About whether I see you as part of Tommy's family or as someone who visits his family." I waited. "I think you were right. I think somewhere along the way, I started thinking of our family as me, Ashley, and Tommy, with everyone else being extended family who fit in around the edges when it was convenient. When did that happen?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he had never thought to ask. "I think it happened gradually. Ashley had such strong opinions about how things should be done, and she seemed to have research to back up all her ideas. When you would suggest different approaches or want to do things the way you did them when I was little, she would explain why her way was better, and it seemed easier to go along with her than to argue." "Easier for who?" "For me. I didn't want conflict between the 2 most important women in my life. I thought if I could just keep everyone happy, we could all get along." "But keeping everyone happy meant asking me to accept being treated as less important than Ashley's preferences." Marcus nodded slowly. "I didn't think about it that way at the time, but yes. I prioritized Ashley's comfort over your feelings because I live with Ashley, and I only saw you a couple times a week. It seemed like she was the one I needed to keep happy day to day." It was the most honest thing Marcus had said about our family dynamics in 3 years. He had made the practical choice to align with his wife rather than defend his mother, not because Ashley was right, but because maintaining peace with her was more important to his daily life than maintaining justice with me. I understand why you made that choice, I said. But understanding it doesn't mean I have to accept the consequences indefinitely. Mom, I know I screwed up. I know I should have stood up for you more, should have insisted that Ashley treat you with respect. But can't we figure out a way to fix this? Tommy misses you so much. He keeps asking when Grandma is coming to play. The mention of Tommy hit me exactly where Marcus knew it would hit hardest. I missed my grandson desperately, missed his laughter and his curiosity, and the way he would climb into my lap when he was tired. But missing him didn't change the fundamental problem. Marcus, what exactly are you proposing? That I pretend Ashley never said what she said? That I go back to accepting whatever level of involvement she's comfortable with? That I provide financial support while being treated like a burden? I'm proposing that we all try harder. That Ashley and I work on better communication, better boundaries, more respect for your role in Tommy's life. And what happens the next time Ashley feels stressed or overwhelmed or threatened by my relationship with Tommy? What happens when she decides again that my presence is more trouble than it's worth? Marcus didn't have an answer, because we both knew that Ashley's treatment of me hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress. It had been the revelation of her true feelings, carefully hidden for 3 years, but finally expressed when she felt safe enough to be honest. I don't know, he said finally. I guess we'd have to hope that we could handle it better. Hope. Marcus was asking me to gamble my dignity on the hope that Ashley would choose to treat me better in the future, despite having no reason to believe her fundamental attitude toward me had changed. That's not enough, Marcus. Hope isn't a strategy for dealing with people who have shown you who they really are. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us understanding that this conversation was really about whether our relationship could survive my refusal to enable his wife's behavior. What do you want from me, Mom? How can I fix this? I want you to understand that some things can't be fixed, only accepted. I want you to stop trying to negotiate my tolerance of disrespect. And I want you to figure out how to be my son, without requiring me to have a relationship with someone who finds my existence disgusting. Does that mean I can't talk to you? About Ashley? Can't share what's happening in my marriage? It means you can't expect me to care about Ashley's well-being or happiness. It means you can't ask me to consider her feelings when I'm making decisions about my own life. And it means you can't use Tommy as leverage to make me accept treatment that damages my self-respect. Marcus was crying now, quiet tears that he wiped away with the back of his hand, like he had when he was a little boy dealing with disappointments too big for his understanding. I love you, Mom. I don't want to lose you. You're not losing me, Marcus, but you are learning that love has boundaries, and that crossing those boundaries has consequences. He left an hour later, no closer to a solution but perhaps closer, to understanding that some problems can't be solved through compromise, that some damage can't be undone through good intentions, that some choices require living with outcomes that no one finds entirely satisfactory. After he was gone, I sat in my garden as the sun set, thinking about the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between supporting family and sacrificing yourself, between hope and foolishness. Tomorrow, Ashley and Marcus would have to figure out how to save their house without my help. They would have to learn to live within their means, to make choices based on what they could afford rather than what they felt entitled to. They would have to explain to Tommy why Grandma wasn't coming to visit anymore, and somehow make him understand that adult conflicts sometimes have consequences that affect everyone. None of that was my responsibility to fix. My responsibility was to myself, to the life I wanted to live, to the respect I deserved to receive from people who claimed to love me. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed Marcus's visit passed with the peculiar mixture of relief and sadness that comes when you've made a difficult but necessary decision. I threw myself into my volunteer work at the community center, finding unexpected joy in helping children who actually wanted my assistance and appreciated my experience. The after-school program became a highlight of my week, filled with young voices calling, "Miss Dorothy," when I arrived and excited updates about their progress when I left. There was 8-year-old Isabella, whose reading had improved dramatically once we figured out she needed glasses. There was Miguel, who had been labeled disruptive until we discovered he was actually gifted and bored with the standard curriculum. There was Samantha, whose grandmother had passed away the year before, and who seemed to gravitate toward me for the kind of gentle guidance that reminded her of what she had lost. These children didn't need me to prove my worth through financial contributions or accept disrespect in exchange for limited access to their lives. They simply needed an adult who showed up consistently, listened to their concerns, celebrated their achievements, and treated them with the dignity that all people deserve regardless of their age or circumstances. My phone continued to ring, periodically with calls from Marcus, but the conversations grew shorter and more strained as it became clear that I wasn't going to change my mind about the loan extension or resume my relationship with Ashley. He would update me on his job search, share brief stories about Tommy's latest milestones, and carefully avoid mentioning the growing financial pressure they were facing or Ashley's reaction to my permanent absence from their lives. 3 weeks. After our kitchen table conversation, Marcus called with news that he had finally received a job offer. It was with a smaller firm than his previous employer, offering significantly less money than he had been making before, but it was steady. Work with benefits and the possibility of advancement. "The pay cut means we'll have to make some major adjustments," he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running on stress and adrenaline for months. "We're probably going to have to sell the house and find something smaller. Ashley's not handling it well." I felt a complex mixture of sadness for Marcus's disappointment and satisfaction that reality was finally intruding on the lifestyle Ashley had considered her entitlement. They had built their life around 2 professional incomes and expensive tastes, never considering what would happen if one of those incomes disappeared and their safety net was removed. "I'm sorry you're going through such a difficult transition," I said, and I meant it. I didn't want Marcus to suffer, even if the suffering was the natural consequence of choices he and Ashley had made. "But you're resourceful and hardworking. You'll figure out how to build something sustainable. Will you help us look for a new place? I know things are complicated right now, but you've always been good at seeing the potential in houses that need work." It was such a small request, so reasonable on the surface, but I recognized it for what it really was. An attempt to draw me back into their lives through practical necessity, to reestablish my usefulness while avoiding any conversation about respect or boundaries, or the fundamental issues that had caused our rift. "Marcus, I'm not going to be involved in your housing decisions. You and Ashley need to figure out what you can afford and what kind of life you want to build together." Without input from someone Ashley finds so objectionable. "She doesn't find you objectionable, Mom. She's actually been asking about you, wondering how you're doing." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Ashley wasn't wondering how I was doing out of concern for my well-being. She was probably wondering whether I was softening toward them, whether time and distance had made me more willing to resume financial support, whether Marcus's new job might provide an opening for reconciliation on her terms. "Marcus, please don't insult my intelligence by pretending Ashley has had a change of heart about me. We both know she's asking about me because she's hoping I might reconsider co-signing another loan or helping with a down payment on your next house." The silence on the other end of the line confirmed what I already knew. Ashley wasn't interested in rebuilding our relationship. She was interested in rebuilding access to my resources. "It's not like that, Mom. She genuinely feels bad about how everything went down." Feeling bad about consequences isn't the same as feeling remorse about actions. If Ashley wants to apologize for what she said to me, she knows where to find me. But I'm not going to pretend that our conflict was a mutual misunderstanding, or that time has somehow erased the things she revealed about her true feelings. 4 weeks later, I was surprised to find Ashley standing on my front porch when I returned from my weekly grocery shopping. She looked thinner than I remembered, more fragile somehow, and she was holding Tommy's hand while he played with a small toy car. My heart clenched at the sight of my grandson, who had grown noticeably in the 2 months since I had last seen him. "Dorothy," Ashley said, her voice carefully modulated in the tone she used when she was trying to project sincerity. I was hoping we could talk. Tommy looked up at me with the bright recognition that small children show when they see someone they love but haven't seen in a while. "Grandma," he called, dropping his toy car and reaching toward me with the unself-conscious affection that made my chest ache with longing. I knelt down to hug him, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and feeling the solid warmth of his small body against mine. He chattered excitedly about his new bedroom in the apartment they had moved to, about the playground near their new home, about missing our block-building games and story time. Ashley watched this reunion with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not the irritation I had grown accustomed to, but something more calculating, more strategic. She was studying my reaction to Tommy, gauging how much I had missed him, measuring my emotional vulnerability to determine how best to proceed. "He's been asking about you constantly," she said when Tommy finally released me and went back to playing with his car. I thought maybe it was time for us to clear the air so he could see his grandmother again. "What did you want to talk about?" I wanted to apologize for what happened that day at our house. I was under a lot of stress with Marcus's job situation and the financial pressure, and I said some things I didn't mean. I know they hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry about that. It was almost exactly the apology I had expected. Vague, conditional, focused on my hurt feelings rather than her hurtful behavior. She was sorry that I had been hurt, not sorry for the deliberate cruelty of her words. She attributed her behavior to stress rather than taking responsibility for revealing her true character under pressure. "Ashley, do you remember specifically what you said to me?" She shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping we could move past the details without rehashing them. "I remember that we had a disagreement about boundaries and that I expressed some concerns, in a way that was probably more harsh than necessary. Do you remember telling me that I smell bad? That my house smells bad? That Tommy needs a bath after spending time with me because he picks up my smell?" Ashley's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composed expression. "I think there may have been some miscommunication about hygiene standards and different generational approaches to cleanliness. I didn't mean to suggest that you were personally unclean." She was still doing it, reframing her vicious personal attack as a miscommunication about generational differences. Even in the midst of what was supposed to be an apology, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the cruelty of her words or take full responsibility for saying them. "Ashley, there was no miscommunication. You told me very clearly that you find me disgusting, that you're embarrassed by me, and that my presence in your life is a burden you have to endure. Those weren't comments about generational differences. They were personal attacks designed to hurt me. I think you may have misinterpreted some of what I said because emotions were running high. But regardless of what exactly was said, I regret that you were hurt, and I'd like us to move forward." Move forward. The phrase that people use when they want to skip past accountability and return to the status quo without addressing the underlying issues that caused the conflict. Ashley wanted to resume our previous relationship, me providing financial support and childcare while accepting whatever level of respect she felt like offering, without ever acknowledging that her treatment of me had been unacceptable. Tommy had wandered over to my flower garden and was examining the late-blooming chrysanthemums with the intense curiosity that made him such a joy to spend time with. I watched him discover a butterfly perched on one of the flowers, his face lighting up with wonder at the beauty of something so simple and natural. "What exactly are you proposing, Ashley?" "I'm proposing that we put this misunderstanding behind us and focus on what's best for Tommy. He needs his grandmother in his life, and we could really use your help as we adjust to Marcus's new job and our new living situation." There it was, the admission that this apology wasn't motivated by remorse or love, but by need. Ashley had discovered that losing access to my financial support and childcare assistance was more inconvenient than she had anticipated. She wasn't here because she valued our relationship, but because she valued my usefulness. And what would that help look like? Well, we're still getting settled in the new place, and childcare is expensive. If you could watch Tommy a couple afternoons a week like you used to, that would be a huge relief. And we're still working on building up our savings account after the move, so if you were willing to help with some of the transition expenses, that would mean a lot. She wasn't even pretending that this was about rebuilding our relationship or including me more meaningfully in Tommy's life. She was presenting a business proposal, my money and free labor in exchange for limited access to my grandson, and her promise to be more polite about her disdain. What about the boundaries you were so concerned about? Your worries about different generational approaches affecting Tommy's development? Ashley waved her hand dismissively. I think we've both learned something from this experience. I can be more flexible about different approaches, and I'm sure you understand the importance of respecting parents' ultimate authority over their children's care. In other words, she would tolerate my outdated methods as long as I continued to be useful, and I would accept her ultimate veto power over my relationship with Tommy in exchange for the privilege of providing unpaid services to her family. Ashley, I appreciate you coming here to apologize, but I'm not interested in resuming our previous arrangement. Her carefully controlled expression flickered with surprise and irritation. She had clearly expected that 2 months of missing, Tommy would have softened my resolve, that the sight of my grandson would override my insistence on being treated with dignity. I don't understand. I've apologized for the misunderstanding. I'm offering to be more flexible about your involvement in Tommy's life. What more do you want? I want you to acknowledge that what you said to me wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. I want you to take responsibility for deliberately trying to hurt me, and I want to see evidence that you actually regret your behavior rather than just regretting the consequences. Dorothy, I think you're being unreasonable. I've said I'm sorry. I've explained that I was under stress and didn't express myself well. I'm here trying to fix things for Tommy's sake. What more can I do? You can tell me the truth about why you're really here. Ashley's composure finally cracked slightly. I don't know what you mean. You're not here because you miss our relationship or because you want Tommy to have a loving grandmother in his life. You're here because you've discovered that cutting me out of your lives also meant cutting out my financial support and free childcare, and that's more inconvenient than you expected. That's not true. I genuinely want to repair our relationship. No, Ashley, you want to repair your access to my resources. There's a difference. Tommy had finished examining the flowers and had wandered back over to where we were standing. He looked up at me with the direct, trusting gaze of a child who doesn't understand why the adults in his life are speaking in tense, careful voices. Grandma come home with us? He asked, his little hand reaching for mine. The question broke my heart and strengthened my resolve at the same time. Tommy deserved to have adults in his life who treated each other with respect, who modeled healthy boundaries, who showed him that love doesn't require accepting unacceptable behavior. Not today, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to his level. But you can come visit Grandma's garden anytime your mommy and daddy bring you by. Ashley's face tightened with frustration. She had clearly counted on Tommy's presence to provide emotional leverage, expecting that my love for him would override my commitment to maintaining boundaries with her. So that's it? You're going to punish a 2-year-old because you didn't like how I phrased some concerns about family dynamics? I'm not punishing anyone, Ashley. I'm making choices about how I want to be treated and who I want to provide support to. You made it very clear that you find my presence burdensome and my contributions outdated. I'm simply respecting your preferences. You're being petty and vindictive. I'm being consistent. You wanted space from my involvement in your life, and I've given you that space. You wanted to establish boundaries around my relationship, with Tommy, and I've respected those boundaries by stepping back entirely. You wanted to end the dynamic where you felt obligated to tolerate my presence, and I've ended it. Ashley stood there for a moment, clearly struggling to find a response that would regain control of the conversation. She had come here expecting to negotiate a return to our previous relationship on her terms, and my refusal to cooperate was disrupting her script. "Fine," she said finally, reaching for Tommy's hand. "But don't expect Marcus to choose between his wife and his mother. We're his family now." "I've never asked Marcus to choose, Ashley. I've simply made it clear that I won't accept being treated as less than family, while being expected to provide the benefits of family membership." After they left, I sat in my garden thinking about the difference between loneliness and peace, between compromise and capitulation, between love and enabling. I missed Tommy desperately, and I probably always would. But missing him didn't change the fact that accepting Ashley's terms would mean teaching him that love requires accepting disrespect, that family loyalty means tolerating cruelty, that relationships work best when one person sacrifices their dignity for everyone else's comfort. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call from Marcus's former colleague, David, someone I had met briefly at a few work social events over the years. He was calling to let me know that he had seen Marcus and Ashley at a restaurant the previous week, and that they had seemed interested in his opinion about reconciling with me. I told Marcus that in my experience, family relationships that require one person to apologize for standing up for themselves usually aren't worth preserving, David said. "I hope that was appropriate. I just remember how kind you always were at company events, and it bothered me to hear that you were being blamed for having boundaries. It was gratifying to know that other people could see what Marcus apparently couldn't, that expecting me to resume a relationship with someone who had treated me cruelly wasn't a reasonable request, regardless of the family connections involved." A year after our final conversation, I learned through my neighbor Helen that Marcus and Ashley were expecting their second child. The news brought a complicated mixture of emotions: joy at the prospect of another grandchild, sadness that I wouldn't be part of this baby's life, and concern about whether Marcus was prepared to protect this child from Ashley's controlling tendencies. But mostly, I felt a quiet certainty that I had made the right choice. Children need to see adults who respect themselves and others, who maintain healthy boundaries, who demonstrate that love without dignity isn't really love at all. The pottery class I had enrolled in turned into a genuine passion, leading to a small business selling handmade ceramics at local craft fairs. The children in the after-school program continued to fill my weeks with purpose and joy. I developed closer friendships with women my own age who appreciated my company without expecting me to earn their affection through financial contributions or self-sacrifice. My life became smaller in some ways, fewer family obligations, fewer people to please, fewer complicated relationships to navigate. But it also became more authentically mine, filled with people who valued my presence rather than tolerated it, who sought my advice because they respected my experience rather than dismissing it as outdated. On Tommy's 3rd birthday, I sent a card and a small gift through the mail, a wooden train set that I hoped he would enjoy, along with a note explaining that Grandma loved him and thought about him often. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't receive one, but sending the gift felt important anyway. Love doesn't require reciprocation to be meaningful. 2 years after Ashley's porch visit, I ran into Marcus at the grocery store. He looked tired, but more mature somehow, carrying himself with the weight of someone who had learned difficult lessons about choices and consequences. We spoke briefly and politely, the way former close relatives do when time and circumstances have created distance that can't be easily bridged. He mentioned that Tommy was doing well in preschool, that Ashley was busy with the new baby, that they had found a rhythm in their smaller apartment that worked for their reduced income. He didn't ask about my life or express regret about our estrangement, but he also didn't seem angry or resentful. More than anything, He seemed resigned to the reality that some family conflicts can't be resolved through good intentions or the passage of time. "I hope you're doing well, Mom," he said as we prepared to part ways. "I am," I replied, and I meant it. "I hope you are too." It wasn't the relationship I had once dreamed of having with my son and his family, but it was honest in a way our previous dynamic had never been. There were no false promises, no unspoken resentments, no negotiations about respect or dignity. We were simply two people who had loved each other deeply and discovered that love alone wasn't enough to overcome fundamentally different values about how family members should treat each other. Years later, when I think about the choices I made during that difficult period, I never regret standing up for myself or refusing to accept treatment that damaged my self-respect. I regret that Ashley was incapable of loving me, regret that Marcus couldn't find a way to honor both his wife and his mother, regret that Tommy grew up without knowing his grandmother well. But I don't regret learning that dignity is not negotiable, that boundaries are acts of love rather than selfishness, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. The woman who had once organized her entire life around earning Ashley's approval was gone, replaced by someone who understood that approval isn't something you earn from people who are determined not to give it. The grandmother who had once begged for scraps of time, with her grandson, had learned that meaningful relationships can't be built on foundations of disrespect and obligation. I had lost access to Tommy, but I had gained something more valuable. The knowledge that I was worth more than the treatment I had been accepting, that my experience and wisdom had value beyond what I could provide financially, that love without dignity is just another form of servitude. In my quiet house, surrounded by pottery I had made with my own hands, and filled with the laughter of children who genuinely enjoyed my company, I finally understood what peace felt like. Not the temporary calm that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep, permanent peace that comes from living in alignment with your values, regardless of who approves or disapproves of your choices. And in the end, that peace was worth more than all the family gatherings, all the financial arrangements, and all the compromises I had once thought were necessary to maintain relationships with people who had never really valued me in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.